Antigonish, Canada. So his topic is Dharma and Dhamma tradition and their significance for the universal human right. Dr. William, please.
Thank you very much. I guess you can put the flowers back now if you want. I'd like to, first of all, acknowledge our venerable and distinguished guests and other distinguished speakers and friends of the Dharma-Dhamma tradition. And I would also like to thank the conveners, the organizing committee, and certainly the patrons who provided the support for this event. I wanted to talk about one sub-theme related to the general topic of the nature, source, and relevance of the Dharma-Dhamma traditions, and it concerns the interpretation of Dhamma and its relevance. And in particular, what I have an interest in is the relevance and contribution of the Dharma-Dhamma traditions to thinking about human rights. Now, as a scholar who's worked on the topic of human rights for about 35 years, and as a visitor to Asia for about the last 15 years or so, I know that there are many challenges to universal human rights. Some of these challenges are religious, some philosophical, and some political. But as I look at the practice of the Dharma-Dhamma traditions, and as I look at Vedic and Buddhist texts, I've come to be confident that at least some of these religious and philosophical challenges can be overcome, and that the Dharma-Dhamma traditions are not only often congenial with, but can contribute to Western thinking on the notion of human rights. Now, I just want to begin with a very quick summary of what I take to be sort of a Western model of human rights. I don't normally like the word Western, but I'm going to use it for convenience. And I think the best known international document on human rights is the 1948 Universal Declaration, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly. Now, the Universal Declaration gives us a list of rights and freedoms over some 30 articles, but it doesn't give us a definition of what a right is. And I think this is rather interesting that they don't give us a definition of this right, and that actually it may be a very good reason that they don't. Now, when we read the Universal Declaration, we have the following 4 perspectives on human rights. First, that rights are universal, that rights are to be universally recognized and respected and possessed equally by all human beings. Second, rights are inalienable. This is perhaps a more difficult notion, but what it's generally taken to mean is that at least that a right is not removable by, because it is not conferred by any public authority. Third, rights are fundamental, and at least in some respects are fundamental in the sense that they are natural. And so the Universal Declaration says that human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And fourth, rights are based on and are necessary to human dignity. That is to say, to the value and respect that are due to all human beings. And then the Universal Declaration lists a series of civil and political rights, rights to life, rights to various freedoms, freedom of conscience, of religion, of speech, and so on. It also lists a series of economic, social, and cultural rights. And these are the rights in Articles 22 to 28. I think it adds a nice balance. But the Universal Declaration concludes with a statement, or perhaps it's better to say it concludes with a reminder of the limitations of these rights. And so in Articles 29 and 30 we read, first, that everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of human personality is possible. And it goes on to say that the exercise of these rights may be limited by the requirements of morality, public order, and general welfare. So as many have argued, this statement of human rights reflects a number of values. Values that, they say, are characteristic of so-called Western culture and religious traditions. And some would say that this Universal Declaration is rooted in Western philosophical traditions. They would also say that it reflects certain kinds of values. And among the fundamental values that many people find in the Universal Declaration are, first of all, the apparent priority and emphasis on the human person. And second, that rights are generally restrictions on others, especially from state interference. Now, while these values are certainly not uniquely characteristic of the West, or even of the modern West, one cannot deny that they are, or at least that they are held to be, characteristic of Western countries, and that the Universal Declaration was formulated in a largely Western ethos. Now, I just wanted to give that to you to give you a little bit of a sense of the context for the kind of issues that I'm going to be talking about, and I've been told to talk about them very briefly. So let me say something about the Dharma-Dhamma traditions. Now, I think one of the main challenges of talking about the Dharma-Dhamma traditions is that there are a series of traditions. There are different traditions, there are variations in scriptures, there are variations in canonical texts. I'm just going to try to focus on some elements that are related to the Buddhist traditions and on a few texts that I think that you might be very familiar with. Now, the first thing that some people have said when you talk about Buddhism or Buddhist traditions and universal human rights is that there is, in fact, no room for human rights in Buddhism. And one reason for this is because of some of the presuppositions of talking about the nature of the self and talking about the advocacy of detachment. And some of these issues, I think, were raised in the previous speaker. For example, throughout Buddhism, there is a suspicion of universals and metaphysical essences, and the rigid divisions and differences among things, especially given notions such as a doctrine of rebirth. If there are no essences, there are no essences of the material world, and there is no human nature. And so subsidiary notions like universal dignity of human beings, distinct from the rest of nature, do not seem to have much of a place. Another illustration, I think, that would seem to suggest that human rights are marginal or are excluded is Buddhism's focus on the internal rather than the external. In some respects, as you know, Buddhism has been charged with being ethically quietistic or escapist. That if the solution to suffering is simply detachment, this avoids active intervention in the world. Another reason to doubt that there is much room for human rights is that there is no discussion of rights in key Buddhist texts. In fact, there are very few texts on what people in the West would call philosophical ethics. There's no word in Sanskrit or Pali, I'm told, for subjective right, and the term human dignity as a notion is alien to the basic texts as well. And so, in this understanding, some people have argued that there's no clear framework for human rights as any part of a social ethics. But many have argued, in fact, that there are resources within both the Buddhist texts and Buddhist practice that allow for the notion of human rights. And I want to just remind you of a couple of examples of this. I think the first and perhaps most obvious example, especially to someone living outside of the Asian world, is the writing and work of Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama. He's a public figure, I think, on a par with the President of the United States. He's a public figure on a par with the Queen of England, although he's been around much longer than any President of the United States, and I think his tenure has only been rivaled by the Queen of England. He's contributed writings over the last 50 years, and I think one of the frequent themes in his writings is the need to respect human rights. We find this starting in the 1960s, and I think it accelerates a bit. In an essay that was published in a text printed in 1984, he says the following. He says, whether you believe in God or not does not matter so much. Whether you believe in Buddha or not does not matter so much. As a Buddhist, whether you believe in reincarnation or not does not matter so much. You must lead a good life. And a good life does not mean just good food, good clothes, good shelter. These are not sufficient. A good motivation is what is needed. Compassion without dogmatism, without complicated philosophy, just understanding that others are human brothers and sisters, and responding to their rights and human dignity. So he uses those words, those phrases. In some other texts published around the same time, he writes, no matter where we come from, we are all basically the same human beings, having common human needs and concerns. We all seek happiness. We all try to avoid suffering regardless of our race, religion, sex, or political status. Human beings, indeed all sentient beings, have the right to pursue happiness and to live in peace and freedom. So let's talk about rights in these passages. Where do such rights come from? What reasons might we have for asserting their existence? In a discourse given shortly after the Vienna Declaration on Human Rights, a text that appeared in 1993, the Dalai Lama stated, it is in the inherent nature of all human beings to yearn for freedom, equality, and dignity. And he refers again to the basic human desire for freedom and dignity. But presumably why rights are important is not because they are desired. I mean, that would seem rather bizarre. But rather, I think, because they are seen to be necessary for something greater that human beings seek. We all seek moral perfection and wisdom. We seek the attainment of general welfare. We seek the achievement of bliss for all. Thus, it's not something about our origin, but about our capacity for goodness, the vision of the human good set forth in the third and fourth noble truths that seems to lie at the source of these rights. But of course, it's also important to understand what exactly these rights are. There is, as the Dalai Lama himself points out, a need for the definition of rights. And part of this definition must include the recognition that rights are connected to responsibilities and duties. They're connected to Dharma. And so here we have, I think, an insight that is often overlooked, not always, but often overlooked and forgotten in the dominant Western discourse. And so the Dalai Lama writes, when we demand the rights and freedoms we so cherish, we should also be aware of our responsibilities. And to meet the challenges of our times, human beings will have to develop a greater sense of universal responsibility. What are these responsibilities? We have certainly a number of responsibilities to others, between parents and children, husbands and wives, between rulers and subjects. But our responsibilities go beyond the particular relations that we have with one another. In carrying out our responsibilities and duties, the Dalai Lama writes, the universal principles of equality of all human beings must take precedence. Now, the basis for this recognition of equality helps us to see what these responsibilities are, and it also gives us a second reason for the need to respect human rights. According to the Dalai Lama, we must recognize that all human beings are basically the same. For example, we are all fundamentally equal as the kinds of beings that we are. The concept of the awakening to no self, anatman, provides for equality in relations to others as well as an interdependence. Moreover, human beings have common concerns and responsibilities. They all require the same conditions for lives and for fulfilled lives, such as life and liberty, security, especially freedom from slavery and torture, and freedom of religion. And these conditions also follow from key Buddhist precepts concerning not to kill, not to steal, and so on. So in the view of the Dalai Lama, then, human rights have a foundation in values, and importantly have a spiritual foundation. Human rights can and must exist because they are necessary for seeking moral perfection. They're necessary for seeking flourishing. And also because they're necessary for the performance of duties. But of course, some may say that this appeal to human rights is idiosyncratic, that he is writing after the Universal Declaration, that he's writing in the 1960s, when rights discourse becomes rather dominant. So I just want to take 1 or 2 minutes and mention a couple of texts or practices. I think that can also be shown that would give some evidence for supporting both a basic equality among human beings and the importance of human rights. I think one way of coming to a conception of human rights is to look at what texts say about equality. In the Digya Nikaya, especially in the Agana Sutta and the Ambata Sutta, we find accounts where the Buddha emphasizes that people from any caste may become monks, and thus pursue the path to Nibbana. It's not that everyone attains this, but that all can seek it. So, for example, in the Ambata Sutta, as many of you know, there's a long story where the Buddha denounces the principles of caste and the pretensions of Brahmins. This emphasis on natural equality, while not entailing human rights, supports a general humanism, and though the term isn't used, supports an equal dignity of all human beings without arbitrary distinctions. Constitutive of this quality, then, is that one ought to have the power to pursue a life that may lead to enlightenment. Another text that has led some to argue that Buddhism entails an account of the human rights appears in the Mangala Sutta, a text that provides a summary of social ethics, precepts, and practices that are necessary for spiritual development. Here we find the Buddhist notion of paticca samuppada, variously translated as dependent origin or relational origination, conditional arising, and so on. This is the general principle that all things that occur do so as a result of multiple causes and conditions. Everything and everyone has dependence on others, physically, intellectually, and spiritually. In fact, our lives are conditioned by others, and our success or failure comes from conditions associated with our moral actions. Now, in Buddhism, all are called to constant improvement. But because the spiritual life cannot be lived alone, there's a recognition that we all depend on one another. and there's a sense of mutual responsibility for one another. Moreover, since all people are interconnected with one another, there is a reciprocal relation between the good of individual members and the collective good. And therefore we ought to act in ways that show a respect for one another. And this respect, some scholars conclude, involves the recognition of equal rights. And in fact, I think also if we look at various examples of Buddhist practices, of institutions, of the existence of sanghas and so on, we see again a number of principles and values that seem to reflect some of the underlying principles of universal human rights. But because I know that my time is short, let me just try to wrap up. I think from what we've seen, we can find in Buddhism values and principles that suggest or entail, although they don't use the word, human rights. These values are respect for life, for basic equality, for the ability to pursue one's religious obligations and to seek the good, the importance of relationships with others, and the fulfilling of one's responsibilities, including our responsibilities to all human beings. These values and duties are part of the interpretation of Dhamma. If we start with this idea of Dhamma, we can extrapolate, I think, a wide range of human rights. This is not subjective human right, and I think this is often the way that people see Western accounts of human rights, as something given to one as an individual person. But rather it's a notion of right that is somewhat larger. And in fact, I think we can take this notion of rights and extend it even beyond the rights of humans. The Dharma-Dhamma traditions then are very relevant to the discourse of human rights today. But let me add, not only are these traditions relevant because they lend support for the universality of human rights, they're also relevant because they remind us of the centrality of duty, that individuals are to seek a universal law and are to conform their conduct to this principle. This reaffirms the often forgotten article of the Universal Declaration on duty. But it also provides a point of contact, I think, for future discussion between Western traditions and the Dharma-Dhamma traditions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.